10 sleepless nights don't seem like much until you see a child experiencing it in a house where everything has always been perfect. In the Whitmore family's millionaire mansion, the silence wasn't a sign of peace, but of fear. The family heiress had remained awake for 10 days, her eyes open, her body exhausted, and her mind constantly on alert. No crying, no pleas for help, only resistance. It was as if her own body had forgotten how to rest. On the outside, that family was a picture of absolute success. Andrew Whitmore, a respected millionaire businessman in the financial market, always believed that any problem could be solved with strategy and money. Elizabeth Whitmore, an award-winning architect, was known for creating impeccable spaces, thought out down to the last detail. But inside that perfect house, nothing worked anymore. Their daughter wasn't sleeping, and neither of them knew how to fix it. Renowned doctors passed through the mansion day after day, bringing technical diagnoses, difficult terms, and expensive solutions that never yielded results. Sleep disorder specialists, neurologists, and child therapists left the house with the same expression of helplessness. Each new consultation increased the feeling of failure. The money paid for the visits, but it didn't buy answers. And with each sleepless night, the fear grew silently. And if you enjoy deep, human stories full of emotional twists and turns, subscribe to the channel and leave a like now. This helps the channel continue to bring stories that show what happens behind closed doors. Stories that don't appear in magazines or on social media. Stories that begin where success can no longer hide the pain. The entire house lived in a constant state of alert. Staff walked slowly, avoiding any noise that could worsen the child's condition. The lights were kept low, the clocks seemed louder than ever, and time seemed to stand still. Andrew was no longer sleeping either, and Elizabeth wept silently to avoid collapsing in front of her daughter. That luxurious mansion had become a place of permanent tension. It was precisely in this scenario of emotional exhaustion, fear, and silent despair that the new au pair arrived. Young, discreet, carrying only a simple suitcase and a gaze far too attentive for someone who was there just to work. No one in that house believed she would make a difference. No one imagined that her arrival would change everything, and even less that the real problem was never just the child's sleep. Andrew Whitmore was 46 years old and a financial magnate, founder of an investment fund so large it was mentioned in newspapers even before the market opened. He had always been the kind of man who believed that control was synonymous with security, and security was synonymous with power. When his daughter was born, he imagined that simply offering her the best would guarantee a perfect life. But now he walked the halls of that mansion like a stranger within his own empire. And, for the first time, the man who controlled millions a day couldn't control a single night. Elizabeth Whitmore, 42, was an award-winning architect, known for designing houses that resembled works of art with carefully calculated lighting, rare materials, and an elegant silence. She always prided herself on being rational, thinking clearly, and making cold, decisive decisions when necessary. But in the presence of her daughter, this rationality crumbled like wet paper because grief obeyed no logic. She couldn't remember the last time she slept more than 2 hours straight. And the worst part was realizing that, even when present, she felt distant from her own child. Charlotte Whitmore was 7 years old, the only heir in her family, and even at such a young age, she carried the invisible weight of being the future of it all. She was a quiet girl with a deep gaze who always seemed to perceive more than she said, as if the world were too loud inside her head. For the past 10 days, her body had been in a constant struggle against rest, as if sleeping were dangerous. Her eyes would stay open until the skin around them began to burn, and redness would rise. And when someone tried to help her, she would stiffen as if touched by a threat. The doctors took turns giving increasingly technical speeches, but the truth was that they all seemed frightened. Some suggested expensive tests, others spoke of hospitalization. And there were those who tried to soften the severity with nice words, as if that could deceive the despair. Andrew paid for each consultation as if paying a ransom. hoping that at some point someone would return his daughter to normal. Elizabeth wrote down recommendations in a notebook. But the pages were already full, and, even so, nothing changed. With each sleepless night, Charlotte's body seemed to drift a little further away from itself. It was then that the house began to function as a private hospital, without anyone uttering that word aloud. Coffee was served in silence, footsteps were restrained, doors were closed without noise, and any laughter was suppressed as if it were a sin. Staff avoided looking Andrew in the eye because they knew he could explode at any moment. Elizabeth began exchanging secret messages with specialists, as if admitting to panic were a sign of weakness. And Charlotte, at the center of it all, watched this tension unfold, like someone absorbing bad energy with no way to escape. On the third night since Emily's arrival, Andrew decided he needed to see her up close. Not as the new au pair, but as someone who might be his last chance. He observed Emily from a distance and noticed something that irritated and confused him at the same time. She didn't seem rushed, desperate, or impressed with the house. Emily moved carefully, but not fearfully, and that was rare there. She looked at Charlotte as if she saw what no one else was seeing, as if she knew exactly where it hurt. And Andrew, without understanding why, felt an uneasy premonition. Perhaps the problem had never just been sleep. Emily Carter was 21 years old and had a degree in education. But that information seemed too small to explain how she observed everything around her. She came from a small town, where people learn early on to notice silences because words aren't always available. From the moment she entered the mansion, Emily felt a weight in the air, as if the whole house were holding its breath. It wasn't just the child who wasn't sleeping. The entire environment seemed to be in a constant state of alert. And that awakened in her an old feeling difficult to name. From the very first minute, Emily realized that Charlotte wasn't reacting like the other children she had worked with. The girl's body always seemed ready to defend itself, even when no one was around. Her overly attentive eyes, tense hands, and repetitive movements betrayed a tiredness that didn't just come from lack of sleep. Emily recognized a state of profound exhaustion, the kind that can't be resolved with ordinary rest. And that made her heart clench uncomfortably. While the parents spoke with doctors and staff gave whispered orders, Emily preferred to observe in silence. She noticed that Charlotte's room was too beautiful, too organized, too quiet in a way that wasn't welcoming. Every object seemed chosen to impress, not to soothe. The indirect light was still too bright for such tired eyes, and the constant smell of cleaning products made the environment feel artificial. For Emily, that room wasn't a refuge, it was just another invisible pressure. Elizabeth noticed this restrained behavior and felt a discomfort that was difficult to explain. It wasn't complete distrust, but it wasn't trust either. Emily didn't ask too many questions, didn't suggest quick solutions, didn't seem to want to prove her competence. This contradicted everything Elizabeth had seen in recent days, where each specialist tried to stand out. And, curiously, this lack of urgency began to bother her more than the previous mistakes. Andrew, on the other hand, observed Emily with a certain restrained disdain. To him, that young woman seemed too young, too simple, too calm to deal with such a serious problem. He was used to people who spoke loudly, who asserted their authority, who offered immediate answers. Emily did none of that. And precisely for that reason, she seemed out of place in that world where everything was excessive. Andrew didn't realize it yet, but that calmness hid something he had never faced before. That night, as the house prepared for another sleepless dawn, Emily felt an impulse that was hard to ignore. It wasn't courage nor daring, it was recognition. She asked permission to be alone with Charlotte for a few minutes, and the request fell like a burden on her parents. Elizabeth hesitated, Andrew frowned, but exhaustion spoke louder than fear. And in that instant, without anyone noticing, something began to silently change within that house. When the bedroom door closed behind Emily, the silence seemed even heavier than before. Charlotte sat on the bed, her back stiff, her eyes wide, and her hands clutching the sheet as if it were the only anchor she could find. Emily didn't approach immediately, knowing that any sudden movement could be interpreted as a threat. She sat on the floor at a respectful distance and let time begin to flow in a different way. There was no rush that night, only presence. Charlotte's breathing was short and rapid, as if her body were constantly on alert to flee. Emily noticed that the girl reacted to every little sound in the house, even the almost imperceptible one. The distant creak of furniture, the sound of the air conditioner, even the slight creaking of the floor seemed to activate something inside her. This wasn't just insomnia, it was vigilance, a state in which the body doesn't allow itself to switch off because it doesn't feel safe enough. Emily remembered nights long ago when the darkness seemed too vast and the silence dangerous. She knew that speaking at that moment would be useless because words cannot reach a body on alert. So, she began to breathe slowly and deeply, making sure Charlotte could hear that steady rhythm. Each breath was a silent invitation for the girl's body to follow. There was no touch, no demand, only constancy. Carefully, Emily adjusted the lamp's light, dimming it even further until the room was enveloped in a soft twilight. She discreetly moved aside some objects that cast harsh shadows on the walls because she knew that shadows can also be tiring. Charlotte watched everything attentively, without looking away, as if evaluating every gesture. For the first time that night, however, her body didn't react with immediate stiffness. The minutes passed slowly, and time seemed to have a different density within it. Emily began to hum a low melody, almost silent, something wordless, without a clear beginning or a defined end. The rhythm was repetitive, predictable, safe. Charlotte blinked a few times, still suspicious, but something in her shoulders began to give way. It was a minimal change, almost invisible, but real. Outside, Elizabeth watched everything through the cameras with a heavy heart, afraid to raise her hopes again. Andrew, arms crossed, tried to maintain his disbelief as a form of self-protection. Neither dared to take a deep breath. They didn't yet know if that night would end like all the others, but something in Charlotte's body was beginning to change. And, without realizing it, this was the first time in 10 days that the night didn't seem endless. Gradually, the room ceased to resemble an invisible battlefield and began to transform into a less hostile space. Charlotte still kept her eyes open, but she was no longer as rigid as before, and the grip on her hands lessened almost imperceptibly. Emily remained seated on the floor, unchanging position, offering only constancy and predictability. The girl's body seemed to test this new silence, as if wondering if it was safe to trust. For the first time in days, there was no immediate resistance. Emily noticed that Charlotte's breathing was beginning to match the rhythm she had silently set. Each breath was no longer so short, each exhale no longer a defensive one. It wasn't sleep yet, but it was initial rest, something the child's body hadn't experienced in a long time. Emily knew that forcing that moment could ruin everything. So she remained still, as if time had no importance whatsoever. The clock in the hallway showed hours that would normally be filled with utter despair in that house. Staff awaited instructions that never came, and Andrew paced back and forth, trying not to look at the camera screens. Elizabeth remained seated, her hands cold, watching her daughter's every tiny movement. She was afraid to blink and miss something important. The tension was so great that any change seemed too dangerous to celebrate. Inside the room, Emily began to notice signs that no doctor had described in reports. Charlotte's jaw was no longer clenched, her shoulders had lowered slightly, and her legs were no longer curled up in a defensive position. This indicated that her body was finally allowing itself a pause. Emily didn't smile, didn't celebrate, didn't change her breathing. She knew that this moment demanded absolute respect. It was then that Charlotte blinked more slowly than before, as if her eyes were heavy for the first time. Her gaze no longer wandered around the room searching for danger, but remained fixed on an undefined point. Emily felt a lump in her throat, but didn't let the emotion show. Any sudden change could awaken something that was still fragile. Everything needed to remain exactly as it was. Outside, Andrew finally approached the screen and saw what he didn't believe was possible. Charlotte's eyes closed, not abruptly, but gradually, like someone finally finding permission to rest. Elizabeth put her hand to her mouth to stifle a sob that threatened to escape too loudly. This wasn't just the first night's sleep in 10 days. It was the first sign that something deeply ignored was silently beginning to be repaired. When the sun rose that morning, the house awoke differently, as if something invisible had shifted during the night. Charlotte continued to sleep soundly, her breathing tranquil, and no one dared enter the room unnecessarily. Andrew stood still in the hallway for long minutes, merely observing the closed door, afraid that any movement would break that silent miracle. For the first time in 10 days, he felt something close to relief. But this relief came accompanied by a guilt difficult to name. It was as if his body sensed that this could have happened sooner. Elizabeth sat at the kitchen table without touching her coffee, staring at her own hands as if trying to understand where she had gone wrong. She remembered all the times she believed she was doing her best for her daughter, following protocols, schedules, and external expectations. Yet, something essential had been ignored within her own home. Seeing Charlotte sleep like that brought joy, but also a deep discomfort. Elizabeth began to suspect that the perfection she had always sought might have been part of the problem. Emily woke up early, as she always did, and maintained the same discreet posture as before, showing no victory or pride. She walked carefully down the hallway, as if respecting the fragility of that moment, and avoided looking directly at her parents. For her, what had happened was not an extraordinary feat, but a necessary step. Still, something inside her was on alert, because she knew that this result would raise difficult questions, and she wasn't sure if she was ready to answer them. The employees began to look at each other with restrained astonishment, exchanging whispered comments about the previous night. Some spoke of a miracle, others of luck, but all sensed that something had changed in the atmosphere of the house. The silence was no longer so heavy, although it was still respectful. For the first time in days, no one was walking on tiptoe out of fear, but out of caution. That difference, though subtle, was profound. Later, when Charlotte woke up, she didn't cry or seem confused, as had happened in previous attempts at brief rest. She opened her eyes slowly and remained lying down for a few seconds, as if she were still feeling her own body. Emily entered the room only when she realized the girl was ready, maintaining the same safe distance as always. Charlotte didn't say anything, but her gaze clearly sought Emily's. This did not go unnoticed by Elizabeth, who watched from the doorway with a racing heart. Andrew decided at that moment that he needed to understand what was really happening. It was no longer about sleep, nor an isolated night of rest, but about something structural that he couldn't see. He called Emily for a private conversation later that day, with a serious tone that mixed gratitude and distrust. Andrew needed answers because he felt that this young woman carried something that no one in that house had considered. And he sensed that hearing the truth wouldn't be comfortable. Andrew chose the office for the conversation, a space where he always felt in control. Surrounded by awards, business books, and screens displaying real-time figures, he invited Emily to sit down, but kept his body tense, as if he were about to negotiate something he didn't quite understand. Gratitude for what had happened with Charlotte mingled with an unease that was difficult to explain. Andrew needed to know if it had been luck, skill, or something he simply couldn't measure. For the first time, he didn't want a quick answer. He wanted the truth. Emily sat silently for a few seconds before speaking, as if carefully choosing each word. She explained that she hadn't done anything extraordinary, only observed what Charlotte's body had been trying to communicate for days. She said that some children don't let their bodies switch off because they don't feel safe. Even in luxurious and quiet environments, the problem, according to her, is rarely the child, but everything that happens around them. Andrew felt an immediate discomfort, as if that explanation pointed to something much bigger than he had imagined. Elizabeth entered the room mid-conversation, drawn by the serious tone of the voices, and sat down beside her husband. Hearing Emily speak about emotional security, predictability, and an excess of invisible stimuli, She began to connect the dots that had previously seemed loose. She remembered how the house had always been filled with schedules, commitments, and unspoken expectations. She realized that, even without shouting, that routine demanded too much of a sensitive child. The idea hit her like a slow, painful shock. Emily then recounted recognizing familiar signs in Charlotte from day one. She spoke of the repetitive movements, the body stiffness, the way the girl reacted to light, sounds, and even the smell of her surroundings. She said it wasn't just from lack of sleep, but from accumulated fatigue from years of trying to adapt. Andrew felt a weight in his chest, realizing that no one had seriously considered this possibility. Everything invisible had been ignored. There was a heavy silence in the room before Emily continued. She took a deep breath and revealed that those feelings weren't just theoretical knowledge or professional experience. She said that, as a child, she too had spent long periods without sleep, living in a constant state of alert, without understanding why. She grew up being called too sensitive and difficult, until she received a late diagnosis in adulthood. Elizabeth put her hand to her chest, feeling that this story was beginning to touch something very deep. Andrew realized at that moment that the conversation was only beginning and that the hardest part was yet to come. Something in Emily's tone indicated a deeper connection between her past and the present of that house. He felt control slipping again, but this time he didn't try to regain it, because, deep down, he already sensed that hearing the rest of the truth would change everything he believed about himself, his fortune, and his own daughter. Emily paused for a few seconds before continuing, not out of hesitation, but because she knew those words couldn't be taken back once spoken. She explained that, as a child, she had been referred to a public sensory processing program for children, the only one available in her area at the time. This program offered ongoing support for children, showing clear signs of sensory overload and emotional exhaustion. For Emily's family, it was the only hope of avoiding years of silent suffering. But the program never came to fruition. Andrew frowned when he heard Emily mention the institution's name. That clinic wasn't unfamiliar to him. On the contrary, it was part of an old investment package, approved years ago in a cold, purely financial restructuring. Emily explained that the program had been shut down because it didn't generate sufficient returns, internally classified as non. Without that support, she spent her entire childhood undiagnosed, unsupported, and unprotected. The air seemed to grow heavier in the office. Elizabeth felt her stomach churn when she fully grasped the connection. The fortune that sustained the family's comfortable life had, indirectly, deprived Emily of the chance to be seen as a child. It wasn't an isolated mistake, nor a distant coincidence. It was a corporate decision made in a room similar to this one, that had spanned years to reappear now, inside her own daughter's bedroom. The realization came like a silent and devastating blow. Andrew tried to defend himself with the logic he always used in negotiations. He spoke of administrative councils, technical reports, collective decisions, and diluted responsibilities. But the words sounded empty, even to himself. For the first time, numbers couldn't hide the human impact of a past choice. He realized that Charlotte could have been just another invisible child if Emily hadn't recognized in her the same pain she carried alone. Emily didn't accuse, didn't raise her voice, nor did she show resentment. She simply said that she learned early on that some wounds don't bleed, but shape an entire life. She said she wasn't there to exact personal justice, but because she recognized in Charlotte a child who could still be spared a path of exhaustion and misunderstanding. That calmness hurt Andrew more than any direct accusation. It was impossible to deny the truth when it came without attack. The silence that followed was unlike any other in that house. It wasn't fear, nor tension, nor despair. It was awareness. Andrew felt something break inside him, something that had never been negotiated, measured, or bought. He understood that the true impact of his decisions never showed up in financial reports. And that, at that moment, the past had returned to claim something that no amount of money could erase. After that conversation, nothing in the Whitmore house was ever the same again, even though everything looked the same on the outside. The hallways remained wide, the furniture still expensive, and the gardens immaculate, but something essential had shifted internally. Andrew began to see his own fortune in a different light, not as absolute protection, but as a silent responsibility. He understood that many decisions made away from real people end up returning in unexpected ways, and for the first time, he felt the human weight of the power he had always wielded from a distance. Elizabeth began to revisit each space in the house she herself had designed with such pride. She realized she had created perfect environments for functional adults, but not for a sensitive child who needed comfort, predictability, and emotional silence. Little by little, she dismantled excesses, reduced stimuli, and allowed the house to truly breathe. Not as an award-winning architect, but as a mother, willing to learn. Each change was also a silent plea for forgiveness. Charlotte continued sleeping, night after night, but the most important thing was no longer the sleep itself. The girl's gaze carried less tension, less vigilance, less defensiveness. She no longer needed to fight against her own body to exist within that house. For the first time, she was respected in her own time, in her own silence, in her own way. This was not a miraculous cure, it was recognition. Emily remained in the house, not as someone who saved the family, but as someone who restored something that had always been missing: their awareness. She knew her presence wasn't accidental, but neither was it revenge from fate. It was a consequence. The pain that had once been ignored had returned as a bridge, not as punishment. And this demanded maturity from her, not resentment. Andrew made decisions that would never appear on magazine covers. He reactivated programs he had previously considered irrelevant, funded silent follow-ups, and invested in lives that would never yield a financial return. For the first time, he accepted that not every impact needs to be measurable. Some choices only make sense when they prevent other children from going through what Emily and Charlotte went through. And that, for him, became more important than numbers. Because, in the end, this story was never just about a girl who went back to sleep or about an overly sensitive au pair. It was about what happens when adults finally see the invisible consequences of their own decisions. About how money can build walls, but only awareness builds bridges. Now tell me in the comments, what did this story evoke in you? Do you believe that every choice leaves its mark, even when we don't see it immediately?